And we are going to continue with our lecture series on the DBQ activities, first with a little bit of a content review for the Columbian Exchange and the triangular trade before we move into using the documents in the DBQ as evidence for our essay to get points. So we're going to be going over the rubric of the DBQ as well and how to apply it. So first up, looking at this map, we know that this is the Columbian Exchange, which the Columbian Exchange is just the exchange of goods from the New World to the Old World and vice versa. So we have crops and peoples and ideas and diseases and technology going both ways on this map. However, if we break it down to the triangular trade, of which there are 3 legs, we start seeing the specific routes and that repetitive exchange of goods and who benefits and who suffers from that exchange of goods. So first up, tell me, what is the first leg in the triangular trade? Where do we start and where do we go? Good, Europe to Africa. So that's still in the old world, from Europe to Western Africa specifically. And what are the Europeans bringing to Africa?
Manufactured goods.
Exactly right. What are some examples of those manufactured goods that we could get? Okay, I see Namita in the chat said alcohol, guns. You can also include textiles, which you can see on this map. Textiles is just talking about clothing. So all those are manufactured goods or industry that's been created and then taken to Africa for the first leg. Then we get to the second leg. So we start in Africa and go where for the second leg?
The Americas.
To the Americas, exactly right, the New World. So this is the second leg, also known as the Middle Passage. Now, what do we call this form of transatlantic slavery that was started by the Portuguese? Starts with an A, the Asiento. So second leg, we start in Africa and then move over to the New World. So the second leg is when we start the Columbian Exchange. First leg, there is no Columbian Exchange, it's just Old World, Europe, and Africa. Then when we move into the second leg with the Asiento, that's when we get into the Columbian Exchange. Now, the population that was kidnapped and moved to the New World under the Asiento, as well as the native population under the Encomienda, were primarily doing what in the New World? Where were they being sent and for what purpose? Yep, exactly right, Namita. Sugar plantations. So they were used for their labor to produce raw goods, noticeably with cash crops like sugar and tobacco and cotton, but also the mining of gold and silver. You're more so going to see the mining of gold and silver in the encomienda, because when they first arrive and enslave the Native Americans, they're going to be looking for those precious metals or bullion. But then as they find that there's not as much gold and silver as they hope, they're going to move over to cash crops, which means that as the Native American population dies from disease and conquest, they're going to be replaced with the African labor that's taken from Africa to the New World for cash crops. Now, we call these materials raw goods. They are not manufactured. They're found in nature, or they're mined, they're grown. And that's where we get into the third leg, where we go from the New World back to Europe. Now, the purpose of the colonies here is to enrich the mother country. The colonies don't get to grow their own cash crops or mine their own gold and silver and keep it for themselves. They have to send it back to the mother country, whether that's Spain or Portugal or England or France, right? Especially with like furs that we see with France. And so the purpose of the colonies is not to undergo their own industry or their own trade, like free trade, like capitalism. The purpose of the colonies is to be a captive market. They send their raw goods over to the mother country, and then the mother country sells them manufactured goods at a higher rate. Now, what do we call that economic policy where the purpose of the colonies is to make money for the mother country? Mercantilism. And you're going to need to know that for every history class, just in general. It's a huge topic. So we've done a little bit of review for the transatlantic slave trade and the Columbian Exchange. Now let's look at claims or answers to a prompt. This is going to be a claim. Specifically, this could be a example of a topic sentence. So at the beginning of a paragraph, that's what you're going to tell the reader your paragraph is going to cover, be about. And so in this claim, it says, the Columbian Exchange led to an increase in transatlantic trade. Go ahead and identify the historical thinking skill and tell me how you know it's that historical thinking skill. What part of the topic sentence led you to believe, oh, this is this historical thinking skill?
Causation.
Exactly right. This is causation. And I see in the chat someone said led to was the verb that led you to causation as your historical thinking skill. Okay, so the Columbian Exchange was the cause of an increase in transatlantic trade. That could be talking about the slave trade. It could be talking about the raw materials as we see New World, Old World, manufactured goods going to the New World from Europe, and then raw materials going from the New World to the Old World to be exploited by the colonizing countries of Europe. And so all of this here would be SFI backing up this claim. If you make the claim that the Columbian Exchange led to an increase in transatlantic trade, you can't just leave that claim and then move on to the next topic. You have to be able to prove it. So you could talk about all of these things, the first and second and third leg, the asiento, the cash crops, the bullion, the manufactured goods. You can use that as your evidence to support your claim in this body paragraph. Also note that you can't just make a vague statement. You can't just say the Columbian Exchange led to trade. Okay, well, tell me what kind of trade. What ocean was it on? Was it maritime? Was it land-based? Was it an increase in trade or a decrease in trade? Okay, so make sure that your topic sentences are specific and you don't just say vague things like the Columbian Exchange led to things and stuff, because that's not going to get you any points. Now, in this slide, we're looking at the middle passage, so specifically looking at the second leg of the triangular trade. And we know that the middle passage was the forced movement of Western Africans, and that's specific because Western Africa is closer to the New World and to Europe, say, compared to the eastern coast of Africa. There is still slavery on the eastern coast of Africa, but it's more in line with what we saw in period 1, and that's going to be the Indian Ocean slave trade. It's not going to be nearly as deadly or as high of an amount of people as we see in the transatlantic slave trade, so two different oceans there. Now, we know that in a DBQ, you're going to be given documents. There are 7 documents total, and at least one of those documents is going to be an image or a graph or a painting. So it's not going to be text. So you're going to have to be able to interpret and summarize what those image sources show you. So here in this source, let's call this source A. It has the label of slave trade, regulated slave trade, and it shows a boat and people in that boat or that ship. And look at how closely packed together they are. So they're packed very close together. Not a lot of room. Not very hygienic, right? And so we're going to see that this is showcasing the inhumane conditions of the asiento, or even here at the bottom of this source, it shows how people were stacked literally end to end and on top of one another in like platforms in order to maximize the number of people that were forced over the Atlantic Ocean into the New World, which we know this was started by the Portuguese because it's the asiento. So Europeans taking the African population to the New World in very inhumane conditions. And we also know from outside SFI that approximately 50% or up to 50% of the people that were forced to go on this trek died before even reaching the New World. So extremely high mortality rate due to these conditions. I mean, just look at how close together everyone is and how crowded it is. That's going to lead to increased spread of disease. It's going to lead to unsanitary conditions that can impact health. And so that's going to be very inhumane. And we also know that sometimes this journey would take over a month to complete, 6 or more weeks to cross an entire ocean to make it to the New World, particularly Brazil and the Caribbean islands. So we have this source, source A, where we can look at this image. And even though it doesn't tell us, oh, this is talking about the inhumane conditions and so on, we can infer that because we can summarize this document to get that content point. But in addition to that one document that's going to be an image or a graph or a painting, we also are going to get 6 documents that are text based. So this source, let's call this source B. This source is a first-hand account from somebody who survived the Middle Passage and then escaped from slavery and became a very well-known abolitionist, rallying for the end of the Asiento slave trade. So if this is a first-hand account written by someone who is a witness or a survivor of the Middle Passage, would this be a primary source or a secondary source? Primary source, exactly right. So this is someone who survived the Asiento. So they have firsthand knowledge of exactly what the conditions were like. So just like source A gives us information that says the conditions were terrible, source B, a text source, is going to corroborate that. So you can put these 2 documents together to make the same point about the inhumane conditions with the Middle Passage. So I was soon put down under the decks, and there I received such a salutation in my nostrils. What does that mean, salutation? Salutation just means a greeting. But even if you don't know what that word means, you can still summarize the rest of the document without knowing every word, as I'd never experienced in my life, so that the loathsomeness, the terribleness of the stench and crying together, I became so sick and low that I was not able to eat, nor had I the least desire to taste anything. I now wished for the last friend, death. So again, a very negative account of the conditions of the Asiento, much like we see in source A. Okay, so we have 2 sources to support our claim about the diaspora. Now looking into this claim, this topic sentence, if we make the claim that the diaspora led to a more diverse population in the New World, first we have to identify the historical thinking skill. So again, like in the last slide, what is the historical thinking skill that we're being asked to analyze in this topic sentence? Good, causation. Again, just like the last slide, the words led to tell us that. Now, this claim also says this diaspora led to a more diverse population. So we're talking about population as in people. We're not talking about more diversity in language or more diversity in culture or religion or crops, right? We're talking about population of people. So when we talk about a population, we are going to look at our triangle, our social hierarchy. So if our claim is the diaspora cause led to more diversity in the Americas, we're going to have to come up with SFI, specific facts that support that claim. So what specific facts about period 2 and the population in the New World would you be able to use to prove this claim? Excellent, Ria. Prior to 1492, the population of the New World was 100% Native American. So everywhere from the bottom to the top of this social hierarchy was Native American. The great speaker or the great son, the scribes, the warriors, the merchants, the slaves or human sacrifices, everyone was Native American. So in terms of diversity, that's not very diverse. You only have one racial heritage within the New World in period 1. But then we see a drastic change over time with 1492 and the arrival of the Europeans. Now in period 2, what does that social hierarchy look like? Okay, excellent. So we have another racial heritage in the New World, the Europeans. So that's an addition, and they're going to be at the top with the Peninsulares and the Creoles. So the Peninsulares were the Europeans born in Europe, the Iberian Peninsula, and the Creoles were people of European heritage born in the New World. So now, instead of Native Americans being at the top, Europeans are at the top of that social hierarchy. Then under the Europeans, we have the castas, and these are the mixed races. So what are the 3 categories of mixed races that we've talked about in our curriculum so far? Okay, we have the zombos, the mestizos, and mulattoes. The mestizos were a part of what 2 heritages? Native Americans and Europeans. So we see 2 races there. The mulattoes were what 2 heritages? No, not Native Americans and Africans. That's the zombos. It would be African and European. So mestizos, We have Native American plus European. Mulattoes, we have African plus European. And then Zombos, that's when we get Native American and African. And this is an oversimplification of the cost system. We don't have to know like all 16 of these different categorizations, right? We're just going to do an overview of the Europeans placed themselves at the top of this racial hierarchy. Then they created a racial hierarchy based on percentages of heritage to determine where you fell. And so that would be the castas. And these are just three main categories that we talk about. And then at the very bottom of society, you have the Native American population and the African population that's not mixed with any of the different categories of races that we have here. So we have three races in period 2. We have the Europeans, the Native Americans, and the Africans. So that's a big change from our 1 to 3. Would that support our claim of the diaspora leading to a more diverse population in the New World? Absolutely. We went from 1 to 3. And look at all these vocab words that you could use to support that claim. You have the castas, you have the African population being brought over in the asiento, and this new social hierarchy that's created, specifically talking about the population of people in the Americas. All right, now this interactive map that I have here, it doesn't show up very well when it is zoomed. And so instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to link this map so that you can pull it up on your own computer. Okay, it's just a 2-minute animation of the asiento, of the Middle Passage. And what I want you to look for are these questions here on this map. So first question, notice the number of people at the start of the voyage. Now remember, the start of the voyage or the Middle Passage is Africa, Western Africa specifically. So look at the start of the passage and how many people were kidnapped and taken. And then look at the end of the passage, which is the arrival in the New World. And tell me, what's the difference between those two numbers? Is there a difference? So what's that population change over time from the start of the Middle Passage to the end, from one ship at a time? Like ship 1 makes it all the way to the New World. What's the difference in those numbers? Yes, the dots represent individual slave ships, and they correspond with the size of each voyage. So the larger the dot, the more enslaved peoples are on board. What do you notice about those dots as it goes from Old World to New World? Does the population change in the middle of the Middle Passage? Exactly. We start out with a larger population in Africa, but then we know that the mortality rate of the Middle Passage is so high. Therefore, we get a lower population actually making it to the New World. So now move on to question 1. Where do most Western Africans go as a result of the Middle Passage? So where are they being taken by the Europeans? The West Indies, also known as the Caribbean, so right here, and then Brazil, which we know Brazil was colonized by which European country? Portugal. Now, what gave Portugal the quote unquote right to colonize Brazil? The Treaty of Tordesillas, exactly right. And the rest of the Americas were designated for Spain. Although eventually, with the defeat of the Spanish in 1588 by England, we start seeing other European countries start coming in and colonizing. So, most of the Western African population is going to be taken to plantations in the Caribbean and in Brazil. We know that the cash crops that are grown on those plantations are going to enrich the Europeans at the exploitation of the Native Americans and the African population. Now, the Portuguese are primarily going to be focused on sugar for their cash crop. But eventually, when the English come in and colonize in North America with the original 13 colonies, that's when they start moving over to tobacco, the English do, and cotton rather than sugar plantations in North America. Now, question 2. Why were Western Africans transported to the New World in such large numbers? Why didn't the Portuguese just bring over a set number of people from Africa? Why did they keep going back to Africa for more people? Exactly right. The death rate of the Middle Passage was so high. We see up to 50% of the population dying in the Middle Passage. And then once they arrive in the New World, they're subjugated and subject to harsh working conditions where the life expectancy is just around 2 years. And so we also don't see repopulation. We don't see a lot of the kidnapped peoples having children or families. One, because of the harsh working conditions and the short life expectancy. So there's no repopulation of people of African heritage being born in the New World in as high as number as needed, quote unquote, for the plantation system. And so the Portuguese are going to constantly try and replenish that labor supply by going back to Africa and moving millions and millions of people over. So a large number of labor is needed because the death rates are so high. Then they're subjected to harsh working conditions in the New World. So many don't live long enough to bear children in order to replenish that. Yes, Ria, it would make more economic sense to, not commit genocide and human rights violations. But at that point, it was just cheaper for the Portuguese because they controlled the entire Asiento until they lose it to the Spanish, and then the Spanish lose it to the Dutch, and then the Dutch lose it to the English, and then so on and so on. Now we're going to move into the DBQ section of using the evidence. Okay, we know that in an LEQ, you need multiple pieces of evidence, and all of that evidence comes from what you already know about the topic. There's no documents, there's no cheat sheet. It's just, what do you know about the topic being asked? So if you had a prompt for an LEQ that asked about the causes and effects of the Columbian Exchange in the New World, you would have to know what the Columbian Exchange was, what the New World was, who colonized it, why they had the right, quote unquote, to colonize it, what were the effects, and so on and so on. You wouldn't have any documents to kind of jog your memory. Okay, that's different with the DBQ, because in the DBQ, you are given 7 documents, and you need to provide one piece of outside SFI, meaning factual information that's not in any of the documents, not even referenced. So like if you have a document by Christopher Columbus and he's talking about the Native Americans, you can't say, oh yeah, Christopher Columbus was a conquistador from Spain. That's not outside evidence. That's directly like he's named in the document. So you're going to have to give something beyond that, like, oh, the Treaty of Tordesillas and so on and so on. So we know that in the intro paragraph, there are 2 points. You have context, which is background information. Then you have your thesis, and there are no documents in that intro whatsoever. Then you move into the body paragraphs. And in the body paragraphs, you're going to get evidence points and analysis points. So the first evidence points we're going to talk about, number 1, you have one piece of outside evidence, not in the documents. And then you have to actually use the documents. Okay, so this is where we get into our content points. And remember, content is different from context. Context is background information. Content is summarize the main idea. So for 1 point, how many documents do you have to summarize? 2. You have to summarize the main idea of 2 documents to get 1 point. How many do you need to summarize to get 2 points? 4 documents. So for the evidence section of your DBQ rubric, you can get 3 points for using 4 documents, summarizing them, and then giving a piece of outside SFI that's not mentioned in the documents. So you have 2 up here in the intro, and then 3 for the body paragraphs. You're looking at 5 out of 8. But also within the body paragraphs, you have analysis. This is where we have the complexity point, which you'll remember from your LEQs, but also the happy point. And how many documents do you need to happy to get 1 point? How many out of the 7? Good. 2 documents. So that's 2 more points. So you have 7 out of the 8. And then what's the last point that's on the LAMP rubric? Good. The grammar point. So for the evidence point, content is where you use the main idea to answer the question. Summarize the document and use that document to back up your claim of these were causes or these were effects and so on and so on. Now, your content statement has to accurately describe the document. and it cannot quote. What we do when we see quotation marks as an essay is we don't even read them for history, right? We cross them out because you being able to copy paste words from a document doesn't tell me that you understand what the document's saying. So, for example, if we go back to our Christopher Columbus firsthand account of his encounter with the indigenous peoples, let's say that you quoted this sentence: the Native Americans were, quote, well built with good bodies and handsome features. You copying that doesn't tell me that you understand what's going on in this document. That's not the main idea. The main idea is not that Christopher Columbus complimented the Native Americans on their bodies, right? Because if you quote this, then you might explain the document's main idea as, oh, Columbus was impressed with the Native Americans and he respected them, right? That's not what happened in this document. He's looking at the Native Americans as a resource to exploit, to subjugate them and take their labor for his sponsors. And you don't get that analysis or that content from just quoting well built with good bodies and handsome features. So instead of quoting the documents, what you should be doing is paraphrasing. So I shouldn't see any quotation marks in your DBQ essays. It should just simply be the content. Paraphrase it in your own words and using them to answer a prompt. Okay, so first on this slide, read the prompt. This is the prompt up here. Using an image. So do we have to use the image to answer the question? Yes. You can't just look at this image and say, well, I'm not going to talk about smallpox at all, because the image is talking about smallpox. And it says you need to use this image to answer the question. The question being, explain the impact of the Columbian Exchange on the indigenous North Americans. So are we talking about the Europeans? No. Are we talking about the impact on Africa? No. We are using these images to talk about the impact on Native Americans. Now, what is our historical thinking skill for this prompt? Causation, exactly. And what led you to causation? What part of the prompt? Impact. Now, can impacts be positive or negative? It could be both. Yeah, consequences, effects, impacts, they could be positive and or negative. It's not just one or the other. So looking at this first source, 16th century author Fray Bernardino de Sahagún, a Catholic missionary, meaning that he's European, details the indigenous Native Americans' reaction to smallpox. So we need to use this to answer the question of what was the impact of the Columbian Exchange on the North Americans? Well, if you were to categorize positive or negative for this source, which would you say?
Negative.
Yeah, that's a pretty easy negative to evaluate, right? Because you already know that smallpox killed off huge percentages of the Native American population. And even just looking at this image, do these people look like they're having a fun time? No, they're on their sick beds, right? This does not look good. So we know that this would be a negative effect of the Columbian Exchange on the Native Americans. Then over here, source B, expedition to capture wild horses shows the Sioux tribe of the Great Plains. So we have to use this image, and this image shows Native Americans, not Europeans, not Africans, on horseback. So would this be a positive or a negative impact of the Columbian Exchange?
Positive, because you gave them new beasts of burden.
Yeah, you're all right. It can be both, but you have to argue it. You have to prove it. David said negative because they were forced to move out to the plains and adopt a nomadic lifestyle. That's perfectly correct because their culture and their society crumbled as it was colonized. Positive, new beasts of burden, more trade. Before this, they had deer and llama. Can't really hunt riding on the back of a deer or a llama. So you could say positive or negative. And that actually would lead towards complexity because you're able to see both sides of the impact. Rather than just focusing on one or the other, you're able to articulate both of them. So either way, positive or negative, you could work with. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look at these sources and then look at sample responses. One of these responses is going to be good. The other response is going to be bad. So remember, the prompt, using the image, you have to use it. Explain the effect of the Columbian Exchange on indigenous North Americans. Go ahead and read these sample answers, and then I want you to tell me which is best and why. So not just, oh, number one is best, number two is best. Tell me why you think that is the answer that would get points. Okay, so first comment I see it has better English in it. So what does that mean, better English? Do you mean like syntax, diction, word choice, specificity? Is that how you say it? Okay, good. Rick kind of helped out with that answer with word choice. 2 is best because it uses precise word choice with no useless sentences and references outside SFI as well as the source. We know that you can get a point for outside SFI. If it's not in the document, any of the documents that were given to you for the DBQ, you can get a whole point for SFI, just one piece in the whole essay. So let's look at number 1, which it looks like we said was the bad one. The Columbian Exchange had a big impact on people. What's wrong with that?
It's vague.
It's incredibly vague. A big impact? Okay. And then it says on people. Well, who? The prompt specifically says the indigenous peoples of North America. People could refer to anybody. Are we talking about people from Asia, people from Africa, people from Europe? No, we're supposed to talk about people from the Americas. The trade increase, trade. Is there anything in this image about trade? No. Maybe they're trying to get a context point for happy, but it's very vague. Lots of things traveled across the Atlantic Ocean. Things and stuff, okay, super vague. Like people, okay, who, plants, what kinds, and sickness. It's a little bit more specific, but still too vague to get the point. This led to many things. Oh my God. Things happened, stuff happened, which led to more stuff, which led to more things. Okay, so you see how that sounds? That's just wasted space. This led to many things. Don't tell me that history happened, that this led to that to that. Tell me, what are the many things? What is this referring to? West Africans were forced to work on sugarcane plantations. This document isn't about sugarcane plantations or Africa. It's about the indigenous people dying of smallpox. So while this could be outside SFI, it doesn't relate to the image. And the question specifically said, use this image. So that doesn't really answer the question. New foods were moved from old to new world. Again, nothing about foods in here. We're talking about disease. And then the very end, Native Americans often died. From what? You just transitioned from foods to death. It's supposed to link to smallpox, to sickness. And instead, you just went from food to death. And everybody dies, right? So this isn't some, elevated prose that we're reading here. So really, I would be reaching just to give them the outside SFI point on this because it's not really relevant to the document that they're using or to the question that's being asked, which was indigenous North Americans, not Africa. The second question, the Columbian Exchange caused, historical thinking skill, impact, cause and effect, a decrease in the indigenous population of North America. So here we see a topic sentence. This is telling us what our paragraph is going to be about. It's going to be about a decrease in the Native American population, which answers the question of an impact on Native Americans. As the missionary showed in the Codex, sickness led to the deaths of thousands of indigenous groups like the Aztecs. So here, what you're going to want to do at the end of a sentence where you're using a document, where you're summarizing it or doing the happy point, you want to do parenthetical citation. So at the end of a sentence where you're describing a document or using a document, just put Doc A. That tells the reader, hey, this is the document they're using. Count up the documents that they've used. 6 out of 7. Okay, that's 2 points. So sickness led to the death of thousands of indigenous groups like the Aztec. Why? Native Americans did not have immunities to old world diseases like smallpox, which is in the document, so it's not outside. But then they bring in measles. That is outside SFI. So as Europeans like Columbus arrived, diseases spread across the continent. So answer choice 2 answers the question. It uses the document. It has a topic sentence organizing what's our category going to be. It's going to be a decrease in the population caused by the Columbian Exchange. And then it gives us SFI, that's outside of the document, and it gives us the content statement of this is what document A or source A is saying. This is the main idea. The main idea is sickness led to the deaths of indigenous peoples. That is an accurate summary of this document. So a document doesn't have to be a book. No, it could be a passage out of anything. So it can be a painting. It can be a graph. It could be text. So like for instance, here's a painting that we're going to use for source B. Here's 2 paintings. This is the social classes that I was telling you about earlier, Rick, where there's a bunch of different categories and we don't go into all of that. And then graphs that are used. So any of these images could be used or any text could be used. So it doesn't have to be an entire book. So now we're going to move on to the second source that we've already looked at with the painting of Native Americans with horses in the Midwest surviving on the plains. So first up, the first thing that we do when using documents is we read the prompt. We have to read the question, because if our answer doesn't answer the question, then it's not going to get a point. If you ask me, how are you today, Miss McNeely? And I answered yes. I mean, that is an answer, but it doesn't answer the question of how am I, right? So you want to make sure that you're always circling back to the question at hand. Using the image, got to use it. Can't just have outside SFI about effects of the Columbian Exchange on the Native Americans. Like if you go off talking about smallpox and the encomienda and so on, that does answer the question of explain the impact, right? The effects, but it doesn't use the image. So you have to actually use the document. Explain the impact or the effects, causation, of the Columbian Exchange on the indigenous North Americans. So we are not talking about Africa. We are not talking about Europe. We are talking about effects of the Columbian Exchange on Americans. That is the question that we're going to answer, and we have to use the document. Okay, so looking at these sample answers, I want you to read through number 1 and number 2, and I want you to tell me which one was the best answer and why it's the better answer that would get the point. But Rick stated that the second sample, the second statement is better because it uses the picture unlike the other one. So if we read number 1, the Columbian Exchange greatly influenced North Americans. This doesn't tell us how, it just says that it does. The question said, explain the impact of the Columbian Exchange. And you just restated the statement of it did impact the Native Americans. That's not answering the question of how did it impact? So this is just restating the question without answering it. New food sources like pigs and cattle gave New World peoples access to greater calories. That is a factual statement, but it doesn't answer the question. This is an impact of the Columbian Exchange on Native Americans, but the question specifically said use the image. There are no pigs or cattle in this image, and so it's not relevant. Europeans like Columbus also enslaved the local indigenous peoples. That is an impact, the encomienda, but it doesn't use the image. The encomienda is not depicted here. So while statement 1 is factual, it doesn't answer the question. It doesn't use the image. In this statement, the Columbian Exchange changed the lifestyle of some indigenous North Americans. A change is an effect. So it's not just saying the Columbian Exchange did affect the Native Americans. It says how it affected. It changed the lifestyle. So that is our topic sentence. The sentences that come after the topic sentence are going to be evidence to back up that claim. We make the claim that the Columbian Exchange changed the lifestyle of some indigenous North Americans. Well, now we need evidence. And one of the pieces of evidence that we use has to be this image. Europeans introduced horses to the New World. So Columbian Exchange, from old to new, Europeans bring over horses. Horses are depicted in this image. Indigenous tribes, like the Sioux pictured in the painting, using the image, used this new animal to become largely nomadic. The Sioux used horses to hunt buffalo in the Great Plains. Now, some of these words they have taken from the source, like Sioux and Great Plains and horses. But a lot of this information comes from beyond the document. The painting doesn't tell us that horses came from the old world to the new. We're bringing in outside evidence to support our claim that this was a part of the Columbian Exchange. We also explain how it changed their lifestyle. In period 1, Most of the Native American groups were sedentary. They had civilizations with capitals and kings and infrastructure. Once the Europeans arrive, however, and their empires are conquered, the Native Americans flee. They don't want to be a part of the encomienda, and so they move into the Great Plains, into the Midwest. The horses that the Europeans brought enabled them to adapt their lifestyle to being nomadic. So they went from being sedentary, settled in a city or a territory, to now being nomadic hunter-gatherers. That is an effect that is depicted in this image. So now we're going to do this again. We're going to look at two different images and use them to back up our claim. So in this prompt, again, it says using the image. So you have to use it. Explain the impact of the Columbian Exchange on the indigenous North Americans. Same prompt. So we're doing the same historical thinking skill, and we're still focusing on the Native Americans. Okay, now in source A, you should always read the source line. This is a painting from the 1700s showing the social hierarchy, the various social classes in the Americas, specifically the Spanish colonies. Many social classes were based on the complex racial mixing of the people. So we already have information about this. We know that there is a social hierarchy in the Americas in period 1 that had been completely Native American, from the top to the bottom, king to human sacrifice. That changes when we get to period 2, where we have designations between the Europeans, the castas, or the mixed races, of which there were 3, European, African, and Native American, and then at the bottom, American and African. So that's a big change over time, outside evidence that we can relate to this document. Okay, so it's detailing that social hierarchy. So if we were going to categorize the effect, looking back at our themes, we have categories like tech and econ and culture and social effects, political effects. Which one of these categories do you think source A would best fit under? Social, that would be an excellent category to put it under because we're talking about a social hierarchy. You wouldn't put it under economic because it's not showing sugar plantations or mercantilism or anything like that. You wouldn't put political because it's not showing, oh, we have an absolute monarch at the top and centralized government. We're looking at the social hierarchy here. Now, one of the points that you get for using the documents is the content point, which is summarizing the main idea. If you summarize 3 documents, how many points do you get? 1 point. If you summarize 4 documents out of the 7, you get 2 points. And remember, you can't quote in your essay. You can't take this source line and make that your content statement. So if your content statement was various social classes in the New World Spanish colonies existed because of complex racial mixing of the people, you're literally just taking words from the source and putting it on paper. That's not a summary of the document. Summarize this image in a sentence without using the source line. Tell me the main idea of this image in a sentence. Main idea. The image depicts the social hierarchy of the New World after 1492. So you see how he didn't copy the words various social classes, racial mixing. He put it in his own words of, this is that triangle. The image depicts the social hierarchy of the New World after 1492. That's implying the colonialization of the New World by the Spanish and the Portuguese. Okay, so that summary of the main idea would be acceptable. It'd be better if you expanded it and said something like, the image depicts the social hierarchy of the New World after 1492, in which Europeans tended to be at the top of the hierarchy, whereas the other races of Native Americans and Africans tended to be categorized at the bottom of that hierarchy. So detailing like who's at the top and then so on, that would be a more specific content statement. But I would accept that, hey, the main idea is this is the social hierarchy after 1492. Because it's really difficult to summarize the main idea of images. We're used to summarizing text. If you give us a paragraph, we can read it and we could say, okay, the main idea is that this happened, or that the main idea is so-and-so is upset about blah, blah, blah. But if you just have an image, that's a lot more difficult to interpret. It's kind of like if someone shows you a meme, like you show it to your mom and she's like, I don't get it. You're like, then you have to go back to, okay, so there's this SpongeBob meme where he does this and it's related to that. And then if you apply it to this specific situation, like you have to just go back and summarize, like, what's the main idea? It's not that this is actually SpongeBob, it's that you're applying a meme to a situation. Due to the lack of female explorers, racial mixing occurred, and due to many new races being created and Costa being based on race, it became more complex, yet still depicting the Spanish at the top and the native and the Africans at the bottom. So that could be a good historical context statement for your analysis. If you're talking about the background, the fact that it was mostly male conquistadors and explorers coming over and settling and then creating families based on that, that would be a good context statement. But your content is just the main idea. So if you put there was a Costa system based on race that became more complex, depicting the Spanish at the top and the natives and Africans at the bottom, that last half of your statement would be content. The first part of your comment, due to the lack of female explorers, would be more context or background information, which is an analysis point, not the evidence point. But doing both is perfectly acceptable and something you should do. Then with source B, 18th century painting detailing a Spanish colonial family composed of a Spanish husband, mulatto wife, and child. Technically, there's 2 children in this painting. Okay, so whereas source A shows this whole social hierarchy, this source doesn't show the whole social hierarchy of top to bottom. Instead, it does a closer look in at one of these families, one of these categories in the Costa system being represented. So again, if we were going to do a content statement, we wouldn't say this painting shows a Spanish colonial family composed of Spanish husband, mulatto wife, and their children. We would have to summarize it in our own words. What's the main idea here? The main idea is that you have different castas, okay, different percentages of racial heritage within this painting. So it's not just a painting of everybody is European or everybody is Native American. Instead, you have multiple different casta levels within a family. You have a peninsular, a European. Here you have a mulatto woman. And then you have their children, also mulatto, but they would be different percentages, thus leading to this complex social hierarchy that we see depicted in this painting, where it's like, well, what if your mother is 50% African, 50% European, but your father is 100% European? Then what does that percentage come down to in their children? Like it starts doing math, right? So there's different categories based on that. So source A is a broader view of the social hierarchy in the New World. And then source B is a close-up view, an individual family with those hierarchies, with those castas represented in the painting. So now what we're going to do is, like we've done with the previous documents, is we're going to take this document, source A, and we're going to read 2 example statements. One example statement is going to get a point. The other example statement is not going to get the point. So read these 2 statements. Tell me which one you believe is best, but also why. Number 1, not an acceptable answer. Number 2 is the acceptable answer. It's the best answer. So let's go through why. Sample number 1. The Columbian Exchange had a big impact on indigenous North Americans. Doesn't answer the question. The question was, explain the impact on the North Americans. It's not a yes or no question of, was there an impact? Yes or no? The question is, what was the impact? This question or this topic sentence just says, yes, there was an impact. Like, yeah, we already know. We're asking you to tell me what impacts, right? So this is restating the question without actually answering it. Social classes in the New World were, quote, we don't quote directly from the documents. Instead, we are supposed to paraphrase. In fact, what teachers will do, if you quote the document, we just cross it out because we can't grade it. That doesn't show analysis or understanding of the document. It just shows that you're able to take words from one piece of paper and put it onto another piece of paper. So to make it easier for us to grade on whether or not you actually answered the question, we cross out all quotes and don't read them. So here's how it reads now. Social classes in the New World, as you can see in the 18th century source. Yeah, that's not even a sentence, and it doesn't explain the main idea. It says social classes in the New World. Okay, what about them? As you can see, you? That's second person. We don't use that. It's not on the job of the reader to interpret the documents. Okay, you can't just leave it vague and say they're going to know what I'm talking about because they read the document. You have to explain it to me. Explain it to me as if I don't understand this document. Don't just say, look at the source, and then that's your explanation. So don't use first or second person, and make sure that you explain the how and the why. So this would not be a good content statement because it doesn't summarize the document. It just quotes the source line. And it doesn't even answer the question of what were the impacts. It just says, yes, there were impacts. 2, in contrast, starts with the Columbian Exchange led to, oh, look at that, historical thinking skill. It is doing causation. So the Columbian Exchange led to indigenous North Americans' culture blending with the old world. So the question said, what was an impact? And you provided an impact. You said cultural blending with the old world was an impact. In the Spanish colonies, Europeans, Africans, and indigenous peoples intermarried. The source shows various ethnic blends through marriage, including indigenous peoples and African peoples. So there's some grammar issues here, but again, there's no grammar point on the AP exam rubric. So I would say including indigenous peoples and African peoples if you want to keep up with parallelism in your sentence syntax or structure. Okay, so does this summarize the document? The source, this image, shows various racial blends, okay, ethnic blends through marriage, including of these particular races. So European plus indigenous plus African. That backs up the claim of one effect was blending because it shows the blending of the racial heritages. So it summarizes the main idea. Here is a hierarchy with 3 different races depicted. And then it answers the question of this was an impact. It was a cultural or social blending with the old world. Remember, copying the document is not the same as using the document. So do not quote. Now, I know this looks like a lot. Okay, you may see this and you're like, oh my goodness, there's a graph. How do I interpret this graph? How do I even use this graph? But remember, of the 7 documents that you're provided on the DBQ for the AP exam, 1 of the 7 is always going to be an image, a visual. It could be a painting, it could be a photo, it could be a graph. So a lot of students will misinterpret these visual documents, and so they tend to try not to use them as much because it's easier for us to summarize text and understand text rather than images. But if you just calm down and just take a look at the graphs, you can figure out how to use them. Okay, so the first thing that we always do is we read the question. What is the prompt? Using a source, explain one impact, so we're still in causation, of the Columbian Exchange on the European population. Population meaning people. So whereas in the previous examples, we've been talking about the impact on the Native American population, now we're going to be talking about the impact on the European population. And so our topic for these documents is the Irish potato famine of 1845 to 1855. Well, wait a minute, that's all the way in period 3. We haven't talked about that. So, oh, maybe I can't use these documents. Well, no, you can use them. Every document that you get on a DBQ or every stimulus you get on a multiple choice question isn't going to cover exactly word for word what we've talked about. So you may have some stimuli or some documents where you're like, oh, we haven't gotten to period 3 yet, so I must not be able to use these. Well, you can still use them if you can interpret them correctly. So this is period 3, which means it must be talking about long-term effects on the European population. And it mentions the potato. We know that that came from the New World because we completed that on our first worksheet in period 2 due to the Columbian Exchange. So does the potato relate to the Columbian Exchange? Yes. Does the potato relate to the European population in period 3? Yes. So you can make those connections. So once you've read the question and figured out what it's asking, then you read the titles of the charts. So source A, population of Ireland and Europe. So it's comparing the population of people in Ireland and the population of people in the entire continent of Europe. So Ireland is a part of Europe. Then we need to figure out what our axes are. Down here on the Cartesian plane, we have the x-axis. What does the x-axis show us? What are these numbers representing? What are those numbers? They are dates. They are years. So this graph shows the years from 1740 all the way to the 2000s. So centuries covering the population changes in Europe. What about this y-axis? What does that show us? The population in millions. Population of who? Which populations? Ireland, good. And that's designated in green. On this y-axis, so it has two y-axes, we see the population of Europe in millions. So green over here indicates population of Ireland. Blue over here represents population of Europe. So the highest that the population of Ireland gets to is 9 million, compared with the hundreds of millions that we see on the other side of the axis. So looking at this, from 1740, the beginning of the chart, to 1840, what do we see happening to the population of Ireland? It goes up. The population increases. Now we know that this is because of the potato, because we're tying it to the New World, and the title of this slide was the Irish Potato Famine. So the potato arrives from the New World. More food equals more people. So more potato equals more people. We see that in this chart. That's all this is showing us right here on the graph. More potato equals more people. We see the same thing happening in Europe over the same time span. It's not as drastic of an increase, but it does still increase nonetheless. So potatoes arriving in Europe means more people. Lots of more people in Ireland. But then what happens in 1840? What happens to the Irish population? Here we see it going up until 1840. What happens after 1840 in Ireland? And like Theo said, this was because of the potato famine. Then we see, though, that the rest of Europe's population still going up despite the famine. So the impact on Europe as a whole, the population goes up as a whole. The impact on Ireland, the population goes up drastically until there's a famine and they have relied too heavily on the potato as a staple crop. And we know that when there's no more potato, less food means less people. Now, that may have looked difficult to do, to come to that conclusion by just looking at the graph. But do you see how we broke it down to, here's the title, here's the axes. It shows us years, it shows us population. Here the line goes up for population, here the line goes down for population. Everything that you need is there. It's just not written down in words. You have to be able to interpret the graph. Now let's look at source B, the production of potatoes in Ireland by year. Like with the last chart, we have an x-axis of years, and our y-axis here is the estimated production in thousands of tons, so a ton of food, okay, starting in 1844. And we have the yield, how many actual potatoes survived to be harvested. So we have expected versus actual, and then how much land was used for farming potatoes in Ireland. So starting out in 1844, they have a high expectation for how many tons of potatoes they're going to get. But then we don't see that expectation met. They expected 15,000 tons of potatoes, and they only got 6,000 tons of potatoes. That is a big difference. Then when we get to the next year, their expectation for how much they're going to produce drops. But then again, so does the actual yield that they get. So what we see here is that the assumed amount of potatoes, or the amount of potatoes planted, decreases, as does the actual yield of potatoes grown. And we know that as the number of potatoes goes down, so does the number of people. So both of these graphs are essentially showing us the same thing, the effect of the famine on the population. But now we need to apply it to the prompt. The prompt isn't asking us about the potato famine in period 3. The prompt is saying, explain how this relates to the Columbian Exchange. What does the Columbian Exchange have to do with the Irish potato famine? That's what it's asking. So, like what we did before, we're going to take this source and we're going to read 2 statements, trying to use it to get the content point. Tell me which one is best and why. So, number 1, remember the question is effects of the Columbian Exchange on Europe. Let's see if this answers that prompt. The source shows a dramatic decline in the Irish population. Wait a minute. We don't even start with a topic sentence. We don't start with one impact of the Columbian Exchange on Europe was blah, blah, blah. You just go straight to the source. Like, no, you have to have a topic sentence. So the source shows a dramatic decline in the Irish population. That is factual. That is what the source is showing. But what does that have to do with the Columbian Exchange? You have to connect it. This decline occurred as a result of the potato famine in Ireland. That is a factual statement, but have you tied it to the Columbian Exchange yet? No. The Irish diet was primarily composed of this calorically rich food. An Irish family would eat tons of potatoes a year. Still not tying it to the Columbian Exchange. They mention potatoes, but they don't tell us how that connects to the Americas. Okay, how does it connect to the Columbian Exchange in period 2? Once this food source was decimated by a fungus, the famine, also known as the Great Hunger, began. As the chart shows, millions died from 1860 to 1900. All of this summarizes the document, but it doesn't use the document to answer this question. You have to always answer the question that was posed to you. So you can have an entirely factual paragraph with a ton of information, outside information or summary of a document, but if you don't use it to answer the question, it is useless. So this does not get the point for using the source. Versus number 2. As a result of the Columbian Exchange, Europe's population grew. Look at that topic sentence. They are telling me, the reader, that one of the effects was an increase in population in Europe, and that the rest of my paragraph is going to be spent backing up that claim with evidence. Outside evidence from outside the document, but also using the document itself. The chart shows an increase of millions in Ireland's population from 1740 to 1820. Now, this isn't quoting from the document because there isn't anything to quote. You just got to give me the numbers. What goes up? The population. From what span of years? Well, we know what the x-axis and the y-axis are showing, so we can interpret that data and put it into words. This was the result of the new crop, the potato, which was brought from the New World to Europe as a part of the Columbian Exchange. So they're taking a document from period 3 and they're using it to answer a question about period 2. An effect was the increase in Ireland's population. How or why? A new crop from the New World that came from the Columbian Exchange. Access to more calories led to longer, healthier lifespans and growing numbers of healthier children. This contributed to a population explosion. That's just a fancier way, an AP way of saying more food equals more people, which we've said repeatedly throughout the semester. Obviously, you can't put that in your essay as more food equals more people, but you can write it in an AP manner of led to, contributed to, growing numbers. Okay, so this actually answers the question. How did the Columbian Exchange impact European population? The Columbian Exchange brought the potato, which increased the European population. How do we know? Look at the chart. Look at the population of Europe. It goes up after the potato has been introduced. So we've covered the summarizing of documents. Remember that for the content point under evidence, you can get points for summarizing the main idea. To get 1 point, how many documents do you need to summarize and use? 2. To get 2 points, how many documents do you need to summarize and use? 4. And then how many pieces of outside SFI do you need to give in your whole essay to get 1 point? Remember, for evidence, you're supposed to use the documents, but you're also supposed to use outside evidence. So 1 piece of outside SFI, 1 fact that is relevant to your prompt, and is not already mentioned in the documents, you can bring that in a sentence to get a full point.